Well, as my students know, it's actually Thursday that's Jersey Day, so you wouldn't have to wear it today anyway. I'm glad you led that way. Since this is going to be on YouTube, my dad will be able to watch this, my mom and dad as well. My dad thinks that really what I do is all designed to figure out how to work soccer into the conversation. I don't have to because Rodney already did. Thanks, Rodney. I'm happy to be part of this series. I'm also glad that this semester that the talks coincide with the Renfrew Colloquium on Interdisciplinary Studies, and so I appreciate Professors O'Rourke and Buckvich for organizing this. It's particularly interesting to me. He was known for abiding interest in what sometimes at the university we consider distinct topics, for example, science and the arts. So he could be a leading scientist in the world and also play the trombone. And I've actually found a similar interest amongst lots of the diplomats who I've met in travels around the world and speaking to people at the UN, even here. Several years ago, we hosted a German ambassador named Karl Theodor Paschke, and he talked about his work as the German ambassador to then Zaire in the late 1960s, where he established the first jazz conservatory in Kinshasa, Zaire. And after meeting him there, I met 3 other diplomats in the ensuing years who also had this interesting combination of practicing diplomat and musician. So that spirit is alive and well there with, from Professor Renfrew on down. Also has led to an interesting series of studies this semester with the Martin Scholars looking at the performing arts and international affairs that Professor Barry Bilderback in the School of Music is heading up. But particularly I'm interested in talking about here at the Renfrew Colloquium because I too run something that you might call an honorific institute. This is Boyd and Grace Martin, a photo of them in 1979. Towards the end of Grace's life, still about 20 years before Boyd passed, they were heavily involved at the University of Idaho for many, many decades and also had this abiding interest in interdisciplinary work that comes together in a lot of what Professor Martin did in terms of promoting international communities. So I start thinking about this question of the unique and the universal in the international system. My thoughts turn to Boyd Martin, for whom I am grateful for establishing the Martin Institute and then giving me this chance to explore lots of diverse themes. The genesis of this talk really is in 1945, which we'll talk about in regards to the development of the international community, but it's also when the Martins became involved and the University of Idaho became involved in the international community. President Truman in 1945 was rather busy. President Truman, Harry S. Truman of the United States, with negotiating the end of World War II and how things would play out there. But there was an important conference taking place in San Francisco, California, that was the negotiations that led to the drafting and ratification of the United Nations Charter. So when he was unable to attend, he sent a senator from Virginia in his place and a second person, Boyd Martin from the University of Idaho, to help negotiate the UN Charter. So this was, the story goes at least, that Boyd liked to tell, that back in the days when everyone had secretaries instead of assistants who worked in their office, that he had a phone call put through. It was from the president. He presumed it was the president of the University of Idaho. It was, in fact, President Harry Truman, and he was sent he was then asked by President Truman to go to San Francisco. So this led Boyd to be very interested in what it meant to be involved in the international community. And he and Grace had talked long and hard about what it would mean to study the causes of war and the conditions necessary for peace in the international system. There's a foundational story to that, too, that I would point you to our website to read if you're interested. But it meant that their lines of inquiry were related to that. What are the causes of war, and what are the conditions necessary for peace? And are there ways in which to bring an international community together to overcome the tendencies for each individual state to think of what it wants to do for and of itself? And he did lots of things on campus. He was chair of political science, dean of the College of Letters and Science, helped start the Bureau of Public Affairs Research, which is now the McClure Center, and several things throughout our state. But one of the things that I think begins to point to this interest as things come together is his involvement in something called the Partners of the Americas. This program comes out of something called the Alliance for Progress, which was a foreign policy initiative started by John F. Kennedy during his administration. The idea was that we needed to do more than just strong-arm people to avoid becoming communists. Strong, not just so much people as leaders in countries, that instead of just reacting heavy-handedly towards threats, that maybe if we actually worked with the poor and created interesting ties, person-to-person ties with the developing world, that might be a better counterweight to what we consider ideological enemies of the Soviet Union than just the strong arm and pressure. It was kind of an optimistic program. It comes out at the same time as the Peace Corps, genesis of the Peace Corps does, which you're probably more familiar with. But what President Kennedy did through the Partners of the Americas was connect states in the U.S. with regions or countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So Idaho was then partnered with Ecuador. There were two states, I think it's Kentucky or Tennessee has the other part of Ecuador, but we had the area around Guayaquil and Cuenca, Ecuador. And Boyd Martin was asked to chair this. And what he sought to do then was to tie municipalities through the Idaho Alliance for Cities, and then a university like ours, in all of its breadth, to work with partners in Ecuador. And that would mean that when the meetings would take place, they wouldn't just involve someone in political science, but it had all the sciences, all the engineering programs, all the agriculture programs, anything you could think of on our campus to bring to bear to help with the Alliance for Progress. This program in the state of Idaho fell by the wayside about when Professor Martin retired, and a lot of the people he had involved have retired. We looked at trying to gin it back up several years ago, but the wherewithal to have that kind of connection with no money proved challenging, as you might imagine. So anyway, lots of stuff there with Professor Martin. So that's really where I want to, where the genesis of this talk for me comes, is in his involvement with the UN Charter and his involvement with the Partners for the Americas. That still then leads to Rodney's question about the unique and the universal and how these tie together in the international community. I spent a long time thinking about this. Maybe it's too long to have to ponder what direction to go on a talk. Usually people complain about having too short a notice to give a talk. And I'm not complaining necessarily, but we talked last August, a couple weeks before school started, about this and committed to the title. And then I started to wonder, if we're talking about the unique and the universal, is the unique that we're talking about a human being? Is that what's unique? A culture? Or is it a country? Because you have to look at, what do you mean? What is the international community and what's unique about it? So if the hub is some sort of organization where theoretically they're all going to work together, which we'll talk about here again in a minute, then is it an individual who's there, a person who's there, or is it a country who's there? In this context, what's the unique and what's the universal? So going back and forth with this, these are the flags of the Caribbean states. And why did I pick the Caribbean states? Because I think they have the best flags, and I thought it made the best visual, as opposed to picking flags from any other region. So the states on the one hand, the countries on the one hand, and actual people on the other. So that became interesting to me because almost any time you see the phrase universal in relation to the international community, in relation to the United Nations, what they really mean is every individual person. So the one part of the international system where I thought the answer is the individual, the person, it's actually called the universal, which is the opposite, I think, of where the rest of the talks have gone. So you have this thing on that's your right, isn't it? There we go. On your right, it's a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's one of the first major initiatives of the United Nations in 1946 through 1948, the negotiations and discussions about it. There was an early push to put it in the Charter. They decided there was too much there to argue about and discuss, and that they would be years getting a charter if they tried to put a codified list of human rights into the Charter, so it was left for a secondary document. Its genesis was the result of many, many people. One of the most famous people involved was Eleanor Roosevelt, who actually came here to give, to tie it back together, Ronnie, the first Boris Symposium in 1948. She was here as a speaker for that. And so you get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So here you have the universal, which really refers to the unique and the individual. So I decided then what I really am interested in is, where does the international community of states, countries, come together to talk about a community made up of individuals? Because it's sort of antithetical. Some people complain about the UN and say it's not democratic. Like, we don't vote for who our UN ambassador is. And I find that kind of a spurious argument, because we don't really vote for most things in our government. We vote for an executive branch who appoints representatives to do lots of things on our behalf. They say, but of all the world's people, there's only 193 ambassadors at the United Nations. Okay, that's true. So do they represent the individuals in their countries, or do they represent their countries? And they represent their countries. Therefore, in this construct, we've got the unique being countries, not people, representing the universal, which is people. So I don't know, we'd have to draw a chart on that one to make it all work, Rodney. But that's where I'm going. So that's my international community, is where does it come together, this community of countries serving the needs of people. We can switch. Well, the first idea is it depends. That's not really fair to say, is it? I mean, I'm supposed to make some determination of what it is and isn't. I'm going to say it depends. There's a lot of discussion about what this community of states actually is. Whether on the one hand it's the United Nations, and my students might get tired of me in class always emphasizing the part, because the United Nations is such a complex organization to start with that it's pretty difficult to say, lump it together as one giant entity. So the United Nations on one hand, with its community of countries, 193 member states, with the powerful West, the US and its allies, acting on their own interests. So depending on whose thinking you read, the international community is either all of these 193 member states working together in concert for some collective aim, or it's pretty much the West pushing through its interests. And the real answer to that is it depends. And you can find examples of either one if you look. And depending on what your ideological bent is, you'll determine that it is always the US and its allies, or it's always not. For example, the United States struggles with the international community and argues that it's almost the tyranny of the majority. Whereas people who don't look favorably on US foreign policy interests would say the US does whatever it wants. And the reality is somewhere in between, and it really depends on a particular topic as to whether it's the West emphasizing what it wants to do, or it's a global construct. I'll give you an example. There's lots of money donated by the developed countries of the world to the international community to operate in more of a collective whole. In some of them, the money donated is controlled on a per dollar share. In other words, if you put in more money into the World Bank or into the International Monetary Fund, your vote and decision-making in those organizations is proportional with your contribution. That means you can pretty much draw a line and say that means that the West is going to control those bodies. They're going to have a larger vote. There's lots of other money that gets donated to things like the UN Development Bank and other banks of that sort, or other sorts of construction and redevelopment banks that are run through Bretton Woods organizations or separately through the UN. And those aren't managed the same way, where the money is proportional to your vote. And in those, for example, even in things like peacekeeping, which we'll talk about here in a minute, they're taxed based on your GDP, which means the people who pay the most are the countries with the largest gross domestic products, like the United States, but they don't give you representational say in what happens. And in those, the West says, that's really not fair. Look at all we're giving. We need more of a say in those places. So what I would suggest to you is that, first, when you're looking at the international community, looking for community, what the international community is depends a lot on what topic you're talking about that generates then who the international community is that you're discussing. Second caveat is it's complicated. Because even though the push towards a universal action or a collective action in the international community is there, the reality is still that those 193 ambassadors represent the interests of their executive branches back home, which means that their primary goal is not to serve the common good, the universal good, or the good of each individual. It's to serve the good of their home country. So you've got a give and take, an ebb and flow, with whether they're going to serve the individual or serve their state. I believe that's as it should be, but it can lead to some pretty sticky situations. For example, we could talk about any of these issues on the bottom, and you can read through those as I talk, but I want to focus on peacekeeping and what's come to be known as the right to protect. UN peacekeeping represents arguably the best of this tendency to put yourself on the line for no strategic aim. The idea comes out of, not of the UN Charter. It wasn't really foreseen when Boyd Martin was there with the other diplomats of the day. It's not in the UN Charter, but soon after the UN was established, it became clear that there were situations where there were entities, states, and two states, or a state and a sub-state actor, or a rebel group, or some faction and a state that really desired peace, but they couldn't quite get there on their own. They wanted a guarantor. They wanted a group of people who would come in under the auspices of the United Nations, put their own lives on the line, and in that sort of setting, put themselves at risk for the larger good. So this started, 1948 was the first one. It was a treaty observation mission. Between 1968 and 1990, roughly, there were 11 of these. There's now been a total of, I think I'm at 65 when I was recounting this morning. Some of them get called peacekeeping missions that didn't really do peacekeeping, but we'll go with 67 since 1948. But it was relatively successful. In 1988, the peacekeeping missions of the UN were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And one of the things that they emphasized was a sense of community. They said this, the peacekeeping forces of the United Nations have, under extremely difficult conditions, contributed to reducing tensions where an armistice has been negotiated, but a peace treaty has yet to be established. In situations of this kind, the UN forces represent the manifest will of the community of nations to achieve peace through negotiations, and the forces have, by their presence, made a decisive contribution towards the initiation of actual peace negotiations. And generally speaking, these were undertaken in places where the contributing countries to the forces didn't have strategic interests. Now, one caveat to that will be that it meant that the missions were not established in places where there were strong political interests. For example, the United States having a strong interest in Guatemala in the 1970s and 80s wasn't going to permit the establishment of a peacekeeping mission there that recognized de facto then that there was a problem with our ally, just as the Soviets weren't going to recognize missions elsewhere. But it represented this tenet, this desire to act on behalf of the greater good, on the individual. The 1990s, though, were dark in terms of peacekeeping. The peacekeeping worked as long as there was sort of a moral force where the UN was acting on a moral force, the member states were acting on a moral force of the community of nations, and the actors in those countries recognized that moral force. But there's a realization on the part of underhanded folks in Serbia, in Rwanda, in Somalia, in Sierra Leone, and some other places, that they didn't have to respect the moral authority of the UN, but the UN was stuck, the international community was stuck, always attempting to act morally and justly, not lying in negotiations, no double dealing, no violating rules of law, rules of war, I'm sorry, etc. So things got really bad and nasty in terms of peacekeeping. And the question came then, if the internal actors who had invited peacekeepers in sort of changed their mind and were going to go ahead and attack their own people without the intervention of the international community, should the international community step aside or just watch and observe as people were killed? In other words, is there a universal demand that the international community take action? This is when the UN looks, and they had observed for example, in the Balkans, when the Serbians were massacring Muslims in Kosovo and other places, Bosnia. When the UN watched as the Hutus and the Tutsis engaged in a genocidal war in Rwanda, or the UN watched as Sierra Leonean rebels stole UN weaponry and then turned it on other Sierra Leoneans. What should they do? So it comes up with a doctrine called the responsibility to protect, or R2P. And this is one where the global community decides that they must act regardless of whether those 193 individual ambassadors believe it best to act on behalf of their countries and say, no, we don't want the idea that you should be allowed to intervene in a country to enter into the conversation. And all those other peacekeeping missions, the peacekeepers are there at the invitation of the competing sides. It's not an invasion. It's not a UN invasion. There have been a couple of those. That's another story for another time. But the peacekeeping is not an invasion. 67 missions there with the invitation of the former combatants. What do you do if you're not invited in? And the responsibility to protect in 2005 suggests that at some level the violence becomes great enough that the responsibility to protect trumps sovereignty, trumps that country's right to act and interact on its own, or if they want to kill their own people, to kill their own people, and they must act. So they sort of put it on display last year in Libya. Invoke the doctrine of right to protect. Isolate Muammar Gaddafi. Arm rebels. Provide a no-fly zone. And feel really good about it when they come out the other end. And why is it complicated? Because in a situation that's many, many times worse in Syria, there is no move to invoke the doctrine of right to protect. Why? Because the reality is that they assess all of those things on their own internal national goals. So the R2P suggests that those 193 countries can overcome their own individual goals and act on behalf of individual people, that the community, the whole, will act for the individual. And we thought, great, we did it in Libya. Therefore, it shows a successful doctrine. But the reality is that once it happens somewhere else, it's a lot more complicated and seems a lot more threatening than Libya did, that R2P is not going to be invoked because it's too hard for the international community. So I suggest it's complicated, that yes, we've figured out ways that the international community can act, and we can be recognized by the Nobel Committee, and we can do things until it's really hard and threatens questions of national sovereignty. The arguments made by the Russians and the Chinese who vetoed the Security Council resolutions say that very specific thing, that once you start getting involved in countries, sovereign countries, there's no good end in sight. And you can accept or reject their perspective, but that's the argument they're making. Okay, so it's complicated. It's also optimistic. And first I would suggest that peacekeeping in and of itself is one of the most wildly optimistic concepts ever. That you're going to take, there's a total now of 118,756 personnel in UN peacekeeping missions from 115 countries around the world participating in peacekeeping missions. There's 15 of them active. They're not without risk. There's been over 3,000 killed in UN peacekeeping missions over the years from lots of different countries. And the countries who take the lead in those things may surprise you. It's not the West. The country with by far the largest commitment to peacekeeping is Pakistan, which is a story about Pakistan very few of us hear, since Pakistan seems to come to us only in terms of threats or an unwilling partner. Well, imagine the amount of terrorism that could be bred in unstable countries around the world where there are not 11 or 12,000 Pakistani soldiers helping keep peace in countries around the world. It's a big commitment. So it's optimistic. So where does it come together? This is an interesting question. I find perhaps the most optimism in this picture here on the top left. This is a dancer from Benin, and I don't know the tribal affiliation, dancing in Chengdu, China, as part of a celebration of the International Day in celebration of the treaty that was signed to protect intangible cultural heritage. This is a fascinating concept. The international community is going to contribute its money and resources to protecting dance, theater, music, not the actual product, not like tapes of the music or film of the dance, but to try and ensure that cultural heritage, intangible heritage, something you can't grab onto, will be protected. It's a remarkable commitment to very specific individual rights. It's not saying that you have the right to dance. It's saying this dance has the right to exist. From that small people. These are from, you tend to be from peoples who are not well represented in the global system. It's where the UNESCO and others, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, work very hard to try and preserve threatened and disappearing languages. Languages that can be spoken by a mere handful of people left in the world. The second most commonplace, well actually, let's see, I think if you even subdivide it away from countries, the fifth highest number of these languages in the world are in the Pacific Northwest. Like if you looked at regions, countries and regions of the world where the most languages are at threat, the Pacific Northwest is one of these places. And the idea that tribes, small tribes in the Cascades or the Pacific rainforest or on the coast have the right to the international community's help is an interesting one. But that's that level that they're going to. I put the World Health Organization, the work with immunizations. When polio stops being a threat in a particular country, as it was just announced to be in India last week, you start getting down to a handful of cases. Is that something that the full international community put its weight behind, or is that an individual thing or a universal thing? But it's one that through the World Health Organization we're working very hard towards. And the final I'd say is optimistic is trying to achieve these goals. These cool symbols here on the bottom of the page are from the Millennium Development Goals, established at the UN Millennium Summit in 2000. They represent the 8 goals for working on global poverty and global human rights standards, primarily poverty and different poverty measures, committing the powerful countries of the world to contribute money to achieving these goals around the world. Today, in a story in the Washington Post, it was announced that one of the goals under extreme poverty and hunger, and it has been achieved. It was increasing by 2 million people the number of people who, I'm sorry, 2 million, 2%, the number of people who had access to clean drinking water. They're now at 89% of the world has access to clean drinking water. It was a goal that they were trying to reach by 2015. They've already reached it, and now they said, well, now we need a new goal because we're still 11% of the world short. But it's this idea then that the community, the global community, can come together to work for universal rights such as access to clean drinking water. So to wrap it all up, the international community is or isn't depending on the issue. And it is or isn't a particular group of countries, again, depending on the issue. It's complicated in a lot of ways, but I think going back to the Institute's founder, Boyd Martin, and the ideals he stood for, and considering the causes of war and the conditions necessary for peace, there are times and places where the bitter instincts of individual countries to act on their own behalf can be channeled to work on a communal behalf to support the individuals in the world. Thank you for your time. And someone has to ask a question before Ghazi. Ghazi's going to ask a question, I know he is, and it's going to be a hard one, so I need a softer question to start with. Thanks.
You want me to leave the room?
No, I want you to be second or third. Go ahead, Thomas.
Do you think this shift towards like sort of a global cooperation is recent, or it's been going on for a long time? Like, is it a slow process, or has there been any recent developments?
Well, the interesting part of the process is that in the past it's always tended to exist only in the aftermath of disaster or conflict or something that forced you to be scared enough to work on behalf of everyone. What's a little different now is the interest in working even without the immediate threat. I think that's a developing trend. So we're not just doing this because World War II just happened and we're scared to death that it might happen again, so we'll act. And then we're not just doing it in the aftermath of a tsunami or an earthquake or the aftermath of a famine, that we're trying to do it proactively. Please, yeah, you're ready. I'm warmed up for questions now. Go ahead.
We know each other well enough for decades, so I'll keep it relatively simple. By the way, the best job that he has, he took it away from me.
Took it away from Ghazi. Part of it, the IS part, Professor Ghazenfar was part of the group of folks in the late 1980s who foresaw the attractiveness of an interdisciplinary degree dedicated to the study of the globe. So that has some economics and some politics and some culture and some language, all in a coherent, cohesive thing, owes in large part to Professor Ghazenfar's efforts. So,
thank you. Yeah. So I moved on to something else, and then they took over the job. So my question is, by the way, Boyd Martin, as you know, was a good friend of mine, often will have me come to the basement and give some seminars. International community, what drew me to come here, the title of this, what is international community? And this prompted me to raise the question, depending on the issue. Now, with the help of the lobby, or the push from the lobby, we are being goaded into attacking Iran.
yes.
Right? In the news media, what you hear about, well, international community is with us. For all these sanctions that we impose, international community is with, well, what is international community? You select few countries.
Yeah, right. So
Europe,
in this,
North America, the rest of the 130, 40 countries of the world are not with us. But in the media, and all of us here probably think of the, affected by the media and all the nonsense that we hear from the State Department or elsewhere. International community is with us. Let's go after Iran. There's that kind of nonsense then in defining what is an international community. The extension of that, you mentioned World Bank. There's a push now to establish a World Bank which is made up of primarily third world countries.
yep.
So that the World Bank is looking for their interests primarily and not depending on the financially
powerful, right?
voting mechanism.
Yeah, so the Iran question is, when you mentioned there'd be probably more than 140 countries that would not be with the West right now, that doesn't mean they're necessarily against the West. For a lot of people, it's just not an important enough issue to be raised. We've been surprised a few times. We take students to New York each spring. We get to visit with several ambassadors at different UN missions and the like. And to ask a question of an ambassador on something we've had trouble identifying their national position on, and they'll say, we don't have a position on that. And I remember pressing someone about cybersecurity about 12 years ago and saying, what would you do in this meeting? And he said, I would go to the beach. We said, what? He said, no, I wouldn't really go to the beach, but I would go to another meeting where there was an issue that was important to me. The Iranian nuclear issue is one that resonates very powerfully with the West and with the countries who are neighbors of Iran. But for the majority of countries in the world, it's really, it can't reach the top 10 of their issues. That's a non-issue, right? And so, but that could be something that drives the narrative here. And in that case, in the international community is the United States and its allies. It's a very narrow community. So it really behooves you, if you read this phrase, international community, to understand the context of the author or the speaker. What do they mean when they say that? What is the international community? It ebbs and flows. Thank you. Yeah, it was. You'll get me later.
So, I mean, we're talking about the United Nations, and it was, created initially out of a crisis situation
Right.
in World War II, but it has shown a resilience and an endurance in lasting this long. We see cases like the League of Nations, which collapsed so quickly. But it has been framed by a period of American preponderance in the international system. If the power transition was to take place with a state such as China, do you believe that this international organization, this international structure, would continue to work in essentially the same way, or would we see drastic changes?
It's an interesting question, but the protections that the United States has in the United Nations are exactly the same ones that China has. So the question would be whether China would manage their advantages in the system differently than the U.S. would manage its advantages in the system. There's no evidence of that. But wherever the U.S. has special rights in the UN, China is guaranteed by the Charter to have those same rights. So they're one of those. It would be different if you asked if Brazil emerged or if India emerged in that role. That could create a different construct.
But you believe China would still work within those same rules?
Oh yeah, they got the same. I mean, for it to fundamentally change, the ones who have that advantage, UK, France, Russia, US, China, would have to change it. And they're not going to change it because they want that advantage. So China's not suggesting that they give up the rights that the U.S. has. I think they foresee it as some issue. The question would be, can you go back to, I don't know, third slide? Okay, so in this one, I put this question about the Security Council and the General Assembly. We didn't really talk about it. When the Security Council, that's one in the UN where the United States has disproportionate influence. The United States complains about the General Assembly of 193 states because it gets outvoted there very regularly. 193 states. It's interesting if you look at the U.S. expectation in 1945 when the UN forms. For example, there's 6 independent Muslim states in 1945. So being Muslim doesn't mean you're for the United States or against it. It's just going to highlight a change in the global community since then. There's now 57 states that are part of the Organization of the Islamic Conference. So when you look at your cultural commonalities in 1945, what countries are going to act like you, the primary countries in the world are in Western Europe and in the Americas, which means in a General Assembly setting, the United States could feel pretty good. There's a lot of people who look like them, think like them, depend upon them for defense, etc. And it's the process over the next 65 years that leads to a big shift, and the United States complains about being picked on in the General Assembly. China's had a lot of leeway to emerge with their foreign policy in the last several years. Their influence in Africa, where they were just spending money and asking for nothing in return. They're starting to ask for stuff in return. Concessions, advantages. Well, then they can start acting like any other hegemon, and I think the system will support them very well. Anything else? Yeah, please.
Do you think the responsibility to protect doctrine was a special case in Libya, or are you optimistic about it being expanded in the future? Not necessarily Syria, but say Eastern Congo or Rwanda, if there's another conflict there?
No, I'm not optimistic at all. Congo's, for example, Congo, there's more than 20,000 UN troops there now. It's an area the size of Texas, not a lot of roads, no infrastructure. how many people would you need there to protect the Congolese? 1 million UN troops to actually protect. So one of the things that's handy, Libya had a handy geography, a handy sphere of conflict. It was relatively narrow. The forces, the Gaddafi's forces, had to travel through open territory where you could target them, as opposed to Bashir's forces in Syria, which are in the middle of urban areas. Congo, it wouldn't be in the middle of urban areas, but they wouldn't be open. You couldn't see them traveling. You couldn't get your troops there easily. There's no handy staging area. Look where Libya sits in relation to NATO bases, which were flying all the sorties. They're right next door. Congo isn't right next door. Well, it's right next door to everything. It's got more borders than shared borders than anyone else, but it's not next to any NATO forces or anything that make it easy to use. So I think Libya was a fairly unique case in the short term, at least. And you had a question.
Yes, related to right to protect. I'm just wondering, since that was invoked or came into being in 2005, and there hasn't been that many examples of agreement between the nations to invoke that, and there's been a lot of disagreement in particular. What does that do in the future in terms of, I guess, the effect internal to the UN, in terms of its moral base or sense of authority? Is there, I would think something like that, if it's not deployed in a unified way and continues to be fragmented, could affect how the power and unity of the organization.
That's a deep one. So one of the things that's interesting to me about the R2P is it isn't just a UN move in 2005. It was formally added to U.S. national security strategy in 2010. So if you go on, and this stuff has to be published regularly, the Office of the President posts a national security strategy each year. Responsibility to protect is in there for the United States. So for the next at least several months, we will continue to push R2P as a mandate in the world. It's why we're leading out on this idea to be active in Syria. But even within the U.S., there's no guarantee that another election wouldn't see the reversal of that as being part of our security strategy. So the UN, is always subject to the collective group of executive branches or executives that are out there in the world, and it becomes even more complicated than normal just dealing with a organization. But you're shifting who's there all the time. So I don't even, we don't know that it'll last, from our perspective, past this year. Well, I guess it would last till next January. So it would last the rest of this year, no matter what. Please.
Dr. Smith, how successful do you think the international community will be in dealing with the global environmental crisis, particularly climate change? Would you say it depends, it's complicated, or are you optimistic?
There's two parts of that. So it's complicated in that there's some things that are going to go very well and some things are going to go very poorly. The part that's going well is really gearing up for the institutional framework to get sustainable development and other environmental issues to the fore. One of the things that gets forgotten a lot in debates and discussions at a university like ours is that just putting policies into play are nice, but if there's no institutional framework to enact them, to actually put them in play on the ground, that you've forgotten a big piece of the puzzle. So the UN, through particularly the optimistic one again, through the number 8, they're looking for global partnerships for development and for sustainable development and for environmental things. Can you partner civil society and the private sector with the public sector, which is pretty much what the UN is with individual nation states? They're part of the public sector. Can you partner them and set up institutional frameworks that you can take advantage of these things if and when the other parts of the negotiations regarding whether treaties should be in play or not get put into play? That part's not very... That's a pessimistic angle. The other part is out. So it depends on which part of the issue you look at. I think we got time for one more.
I'll make a comment for you.
Okay.
An add on to what you said. You mentioned about the 5 Islamic countries at one time in 1957. No. After World War II, there was a massive decolonization process, and the countries became independent. So it's not just those 57.
Correct. All this, yeah.
A whole bunch of third world.
51 countries in,
South America, Asia, Africa.
right, we went from 51 to 193.
Yeah, and often we in the West find some difference of opinion culturally in terms of values, in terms of priorities with all of them.
Correct.
All of them, not just those 57. 57 are a little bit more prominent now, but India at one time, countries in South America, there's the Hugo Chavez and so on, all kind of people we find differences of opinion and conflicts arise because our priorities sometimes don't coincide with their priorities. So it's whole rest of the third world country.
Right, and it's another one of the initiatives when you're talking about partnerships as to whether partnerships should be, partnerships historically have tended to be north-south or west-east. They're trying to develop frameworks so you can have south-south partnerships and sort of capitalize on the non-aligned movement, the Group of 77, those other independent states, and get them working together better for the future. Anyway, thanks for your time. I'm happy to stay out and chat if you want. Otherwise, thanks for coming.